What's up guys? In this video I'm going to be showcasing 4 different fleets featuring Lion that performed quite well in Hornet meta. Since Lion is an extremely powerful ship with no restrictions that need fulfilling, you can pretty much stick her in any fleet and she'll probably end up being an upgrade over the ship she replaced. As we're at the end of Hornet meta cycle, I only have 3 support attempts per day, as there is really powerful artillery support for my own raids that knock off I think almost 20 bars of HP by this point. As such, I can't really do what I was able to at the beginning of Hornet meta and do a whole bunch of runs and then report to you with a reasonable success rate. And of course, it follows that they're not going to be optimal or anything because I don't have the time to tinker around with every little detail. Just think of it as ideas to keep in mind and experiment with later down the line for future fights. Now, for this video, I'm going to try out a new format, where I first give my thought process when I build the fleet, and then show the fight by itself, give some thoughts again after each battle, and then some final thoughts at the very end after all the fleets have been shown. I'll leave timestamps and label what I think is the distinguishing factor for each fleet. Also, there's another fleet in the video I uploaded before this one, if you want to go check that one out as well. First up is the Lion, Soyuz, and Alsace fleet. The fleet is a pretty straightforward 4-salvo battleship fleet, using Soyuz as the slower. I'm using Brest in the Vanguard just to make Alsace's fleet-wide damage buff permanent, which helps the already high damaging Vanguard dish out even more damage. Here's the fleet in action. Okay, the battle ended at 0 seconds remaining, but I think that a few shells were still in the process of hitting Hornet as the battle was ending, so it was more of a close run in terms of timing than damage. Looking at the end screen, Alsace ended up taking MVP, proving that Lion is really just a Plymouth merchant. But jokes aside, Lion does have a unique burn which is applied at the very start of battle, and the technology just isn't quite there yet in 2025 to account for damage over time effects in the end screen. With that, as well as just battleships having a huge part of their damage being tied to crit, which can have large variances from battle to battle, it's not uncommon to get end screens like this one, although all this coping won't necessarily change the fact that she's not a huge step up over Alsace, I would say. As for the Vanguard, Hindenburg's damage obviously didn't look too impressive compared to Z-52's, and Hindenburg is only being used for her damage and nothing else, So you might be tempted to think she's not contributing much here, but keep in mind that she doesn't have an anti-air gun and there are a lot of planes in this fight, so actually a decent chunk of Z-52's damage is coming from the anti-air. Rest assured that Hindenburg still deals a significant amount of damage more than Z-52. A couple of alternatives that could be as good or even better are, of course, Plymouth and Trafalgar. I can't tell you for certain whether Plymouth, with her slightly higher personal damage and flagship buff, would be for sure better than Brest, making Alsace's debuff permanent, but if I had to guess, I would say yes. But that would be something that needs a pretty large sample size to parse. I do think they would contribute a bit more than Hindenburg in total, though. In the next fleet, I'm using a KMS core, but with the 2 new URs as well. This time, it's going to be a 3-strike fleet because getting 4 strikes with LA9s is not something that Rumey is going to be capable of. This combination of Bismarck Sway and Fritz Rumey is just overall slightly weaker than Soyuz and Nakhimov, but they're not without their merits. While Bismarck can't match the total damage contribution of Soyuz due to her lack of carrier buffs, and Rumey's 60% slow when paired with Bismarck's Black Hole is definitely not the same thing as Nakhimov's full route, 60% slow is good enough to be somewhat consistent, and their damage is still great and could potentially be stronger against light armor if such a situation ever arises. Aside from the Black Hole though, the Ironblood pair also has the benefit of having stronger Vanguard options to buff, as you can see with Z-52 and Hindenburg in the Vanguard. With that being said, if this works, then of course Soyuz and Nakhimov will work as well with Lion. It's kind of like a vanilla and chocolate ice cream situation. Vanilla is probably going to be more commonly enjoyed, but there may be situations that call for chocolate, and some people might just enjoy chocolate more in general. Now, let's take a look at how they do in the fight. Okay, even though 4 of the ships are KMS, there isn't any KMS specific buff to Bismarck Sway other than her own, and her own buff doesn't give anything to Rumey. It honestly kinda still annoys me that Bismarck buffs anti-air instead of aviation like Soyuz. Anyway, the point is that, once again, without being buffed by Plymouth, Lion isn't going to be pulling double of Bismarck's damage or anything like that. Still the best, but your other ships are still safe and usable, even with her addition to the game. Also, seeing Rumey's damage here did remind me that Trafalgar actually happens to be much better for carriers than battleships, although you can't use her in a triple carrier fleet. This is because battleships get way more bonus accuracy from equipment and fleet tech than carriers, making her evasion debuff way more valuable for carriers. Something else to consider is that if you're using Trafalgar, it might be better to replace the sword augment for a crossbow instead, even if the enemy has high evasion, as the accuracy is not as important. But I haven't run the numbers on that, so just take it into consideration and not as gospel. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention, but I had to drop my fleet tech carrier reload to 0 for this fleet to sink Rumey with a black hole. This is the only fleet of the 4 I'm showing that needed any kind of fleet tech adjustment. In the next fleet, I'm using a ship that you probably wouldn't even have considered before, but actually turns out to work exceptionally well in this battle, and that is Centaur. The main strength Centaur has is the ability to comfortably get 4 airstrikes with LA-9s without sacrificing much from her other equipment slots in terms of damage. This is because of a combination of her high base reload as a light carrier, even more reload from light carrier fleet tech, and then even more reload from her unique augment, something that the majority of the most powerful carriers don't have access to. And even with all that, she's still not exactly going to be matching UR carriers in terms of damage, even if they only do 3 strikes to her 4, but her extra main fleet buffs for powerful ships like Lion and Soyuz help to close the gap. Now, I didn't want to use Soyuz here, but unfortunately, Centaur's airstrike isn't fast enough to apply her slow barrage before the battleships fire, as there is a travel time for her barrage slow as opposed to a slow like Arc Royals, so Soyuz is needed to make sure the battleships land mostly everything. You might be wondering, what about if I used Implacable, who not only can root the boss but is also HMS, which would be more fitting with the theme as opposed to Soyuz, but unfortunately, Implacable can't get off 4 airstrikes without totally gimping her loadout for a low cooldown, which would result in too little damage being dealt. And also, there's just no other HMS ship that's going to be able to replace what Z-52 can do here. I'll now show the fleet in action. Unfortunately, this fleet overkilled a little at the end and didn't even get to see the last round of attacks go off. This makes me think that this fleet would probably be very consistent, being a 4-strike fleet that can kill with 3 strikes and doesn't rely much on RNG overall. Every ship in the fleet increases Lion's damage dealt in some way, so it's no surprise to see her carry the bulk of the damage being dealt here. Since we didn't get to see what the last round of attacks will look like, I ran it again just to make sure the timing works out at the end, and it does. Now, for the final fleet, I wanted to see how much damage I could make Hindenburg pump out, so you'll notice that every ship in the fleet increases Hindenburg's damage in some way. That's pretty much it. Let's see how it performs.
ちぎれ。戦艦ビスマルク、未来を切り開く。
飛ばせバースト、燃え上がれサンダーハート。
噛みちぎれ。噛みちぎれ。
ロイヤルフラッシュ退屈ね。
戦艦ビスマルク、未来を切り開く。
恥ずかしいからやっぱりなし。
噛みちぎれ。噛みちぎれ。
ロイヤルフラッシュ退屈ね。サンダーハート故障した。
戦艦ビスマルク、未来を切り開く。
恥ずかしいからやっぱりなし。暁の光の中にある。
噛みちぎれ。噛みちぎれ。
ロイヤルフラッシュ退屈ね。
戦艦ビスマルク、未来を切り開く。噛みちぎれ。
ロイヤルフラッシュ恥ずかしいからやっぱりなし。
戦場はコール、勝者が王になる。勝利とは事狩りを語っているのだ。
Once again, Lion's damage isn't all that far from Bismarck's without Plymouth, although it is a bit understated because of the burn is missing from it. Hindenburg dealt 266,000 damage, which still doesn't look that impressive compared to Z52, but keep in mind once again that all of Hindenburg's damage comes from her damage against the boss, whereas some of not only Z52's, but also the battleships' damage is coming from anti-air, so if we could somehow remove anti-air damage from the end screen, Hindenburg's damage here would be much closer to Lion and Bismarck's ways than Z52. Alright, that about wraps up the showcase of the fleets. I didn't really think it would happen, but Lion actually brought battleships back. And actually, the most difficult fleet to make work in this fight now is triple carriers. They don't benefit from the addition of Trafalgar or Lion. They can't guarantee all their damage lands while maximizing for damage at the same time, whereas Soyuz alone can guarantee your damage lands in a battleship or hybrid fleet. And they also have to worry about staying concealed, and getting force strikes is kind of a pain in the ass with the slow LA9s. Ultimately though, I've always been a fan of using hybrid fleets anyway, or rather not being particularly emotionally invested into a fleet type. It just sounds silly to me to even say that I'm like a carrier main or something. I still prefer carriers in a pragmatic sense since they don't waste time when they strike, but I'm going to continue using whatever works and not lose sleep because my favorite hull type isn't the best by far in the game or something. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.